27. Takuda spent the 2 days preparing for the confrontation he knew would come. He wasn't quite sure what to expect from the patrols he'd sent out, but he didn't have enough information about the enclaves to make even a tentative decision about the future. He felt a nagging doubt, one that grew every day, that there was more separation between the enclaves than he had first imagined. Dealing with 3 disparate societies was not what he had planned. Surely, he had thought, there must be some connection, however tenuous, with the heritage that he knew and understood. Now, he feared that he'd been wrong. With his skeleton force, Takuda made the best defensive preparations he could. The battle mechs were kept well to the rear. Their long-range laser weapons were better in support than their twin machine gun armament could ever be close in. If it came to the point where the machine guns were important, the situation would be beyond salvation. The Locusts, their pilots and technicians, and the Tatate who they'd adopted as extra help, were bedded down in a ravine 3 kilometers behind the edge of the woods. If needed, they could be on the front lines in something less than 10 minutes. The infantry were spread out across the edge of the woods, with the 2 light teams on the flanks, the headquarters and heavy weapons in the center. Horg and Lost were alone on the flanks, Takuda and Parker DeVoot in the center. A team deploying seismic sensors were in the grasslands beyond the wood edge. With 3 members of the unit on patrol, the others did all the digging. Here again, the Tatate proved invaluable. All the humans needed to do was give some indication of what they wanted, and the Tatate set happily to work digging holes in the ground. In less time than it would have taken a combined engineering unit to accomplish the task, the Tatate had created complex underground tunnel systems. Indeed, it took some effort on Dakoto's part to get them to stop their burrowing. The savanna that fell away from the forest toward the broad river beyond was filled both days with the activity of combat. Takuda watched the intricate ballet through his binoculars, intrigued by the equipment and weapons he saw. The combatants were from Usagumo, moving from the south, and Amatukaze, approaching from the north. The forces deployed a kilometer apart without interference from the opposition. Then, as if by some unseen signal, they would come at each other. Takuda was able to identify simple missile and melee weapons on both sides of the lines. The long firearms, bulky and cumbersome, carried by blocks of men many ranks deep, were used to cover the deployment and movements of small groups of individuals with better-looking, belt-fed devices. These infantry groups would feint and dodge at each other with little contact. The main battle was carried on by mechanized forces that acted like champions, moving forward as individuals to engage in single combat with the champions from the other side. The champions were similar to the vehicles Takuda had seen on the first evening. Great steam-driven or internal combustion machines with slug-throwing weapons of various sizes and numbers. The Usagumo had a great boxy vehicle mounted on 6 wheels with a huge trash can protruding from its sloping snout. It would rumble slowly across the terrain until it reached a comfortable range. Then it would stop, the cannon rising and falling as though sniffing the air for the enemy. It would freeze, and a moment later would come a cloud of smoke and a great cylinder of stone arcing from the gun toward the target. It wasn't very accurate, and a nimble opponent could easily dodge. But most of the targets were not nimble. When the stone came down on an unfortunate opponent, the results were spectacular. Takuda saw one vehicle, struck on the roof, break in half under the impact. An instant later, there was a catastrophic explosion, probably caused by the rupture of the fuel cell. A huge cloud of flame and white smoke rose from the victim. No one emerged. On the first full day, the mechs appeared off to the south. Takuda held his breath as he waited for them to discover his group, but they paid no attention to his presence. The panther had stalked through the trees and paused. Then, with almost casual indifference, it had raised its right arm and fired the PPC at a champion from the north. The vehicle disintegrated under the blast. As if to even up the fight, it then fired the weapon at the Usagumo vehicle that had been engaged with it in combat. The demonstration over, and the sides returned to equality. The panther had departed. After the end of battle each day, the combatants would retreat from the field, dragging what vehicles they could. The only time Takuda saw actual blows exchanged between the infantry forces was when the Amatsukaze tried to capture one of the Usagumo vehicles damaged close to their lines. The Usagumo rushed the robbers, deploying a block of infantry into a long line. There had been a roar of gunfire from the advancing force, returned by a ragged patter from the Amatsukaze. Then the Amatsukaze had retreated quickly like small children discovered in some prank. A cloud of sulphurous smoke drifted over the deserted field. Late in the evening on the second day, Horg reported IR blips coming from the north. An hour later, he reported a second target. There were the patrols returning from Osio and Amatsukaze. Takuda passed the word of their approach and notified Los to be alert for the patrols. Arsenault was the first into the headquarters burrow. After glancing around at the complex of tunnels and shafts, he lifted his eyes in amazement. Takuda had indicated the Tatate as the architects, but did not wait for the second patrol to arrive before taking the Gunso's report. Arsenault told him they had taken rooms in a small traveler's ryokan near one of the gates. The people they met had described life in Osio as a feudal system gone crazy. The samurai lords dominated everything, freely using their katana to enforce their control. Arsenault had seen at least 2 beheadings in the street when a lower member of the society had not been acceptably subservient to a lord. No one had said a word or even touched the body until well after the samurai had departed. Some of the Osio they had met would be willing to throw off their shackles, but there are not many of these. The enclave was seething with unfocused unrest, but most of it was sublimated that the immediate chances of a coup were scant. Takuda considered the report. Working in Osio would take time, but seemed to hold out hope, given that time. Its people were nominally loyal, but that loyalty might be quite brittle. There had been no mention of the presence of the mercenaries. That in itself was on the positive side of the equation. Knight and Holland appeared at the headquarters shortly after Arsenault had finished his report. After 2 days among the Amatsukaze, they had nothing good to say about them. They were, said Holland, religious fanatics who hated the other enclaves as heretics. The whole concept of religion gone wild made Holland shudder. The Amatsukaze dealt with the others because it was necessary for their survival, but they were engaged in a continuing war with the Usagumo over some liturgical slight the merchants had committed. The possibility of the Dest group turning anyone they met was reported as being low to non-existent. The populace was so indoctrinated by religious fervor that they would be probably totally unresponsive. Some of the younger people might be receptive, but even those should not be considered reliable. Again, Takuda had to consider the implications that no one had even mentioned the mercenaries. This time, it did not seem positive, the implication being that the mercs had made their decision to go with the Usagumo. Seagroves must have had more impact on Vost than anyone imagined. Now he had only to await the report of Sine and Miranda. Johann Miranda returned just before dawn, alone except for Topi. He was still in mundane dress, having left the Usagumo enclave so quickly that he hadn't bothered to change back into his uniform. His report came in a flood of unconnected sentences. Sine had been captured by the Usagumo and presumably turned over to Vost and his crew. There was no way of knowing what would happen to her, but Miranda was sure that the presence, if not the location, of the Dest group was known. Sine had gone with Homa Sirayuki for a meeting with some of the important members of the Enclave, but according to Deka, it had been a trap. She had left instructions for Miranda to flee the city in such an event. He had disobeyed and spent time searching for her, but without success. Deka and Pikete had finally convinced him to return to Takuta for help. The people in Usagumo had made contact with the mercenaries, reported Miranda, and evidently they were about to strike a deal. The mechs would make their appearance on the battlefield under the control of the Usagumo very soon. Money was the driving force behind the Usagumo. There were those at the top of the pile, and there were those at the bottom. But either way, it was wealth everyone wanted. There would be plenty of ways to overthrow those at the top, but it would be difficult to convince them that a better society existed. Takuta was faced with two problems, both of them immediate and imperative. By first light, he could expect the mercs to attack from the Usagumo enclave. Even if they didn't know his exact location, they could make some assumptions. They would come looking for them, and they would probably have the support of the Usagumo ground troops. The infantry and vehicles would not be a problem, but he couldn't afford more casualties to his already weakened force. The second problem was the capture of Sine. It was a tradition among Dest not to leave people behind, not even the dead. Now one of his team had been captured. She would have to be rescued, or at least returned as soon as possible. He turned to Emerdine Knight, who had reappeared in the headquarters unbidden, almost as though he knew his presence would be requested.
"Knight," ordered Takuta, "take your section with Miranda and Topi. Get Sine."
Knight nodded and left. That took care of the second problem. Now he must deal with the first, an imminent attack by the mercenaries. As far as Takuta could tell, he had two choices: fight the mercs where they were, or run for the cover of the woods and ravines. If he chose the former, the knight and his section would not know where to return. But there might not be anything left for them to come home to. If he ran, there was no assurance that the team would survive. He explained the problem to Parker DeVood, hoping the former dropship pilot might have some other ideas. He didn't. But Dakota, listening to the discussion, did. He had seen the locusts stumbling around under the trees at the first camp. He had seen Mark Jacobs falling down repeatedly during the march to the enclaves. Now he asked questions about what the mechs could really see. Why not, he proposed, build a fake position and let the enemy mechs literally stumble into it? Not only would it give Takuta the chance to do some damage, but it might also reduce the perceived value of the mechs to their prospective employers. Takuta considered the possibilities. He had seen the Tatate in their digging frenzy, and they certainly were capable of excavating traps. It just might work, he thought, and it certainly was worth a try. He turned to Dakota and gave his consent. They would fall back slightly into the woods, leaving IR emitters behind. That would draw the mercenaries onto the position. The Tatate would handle the construction of the traps.